Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. The Killer Women vodcast is pleased to be a part of the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. To learn more about Danielle and her books, visit her at www.daniellegirard.com, and to access all of our vodcasts, go to youtube.com/Authors on the Air. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Welcome to the Killer Women podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Network. I'm your host, Danielle Girard, and today's guest is Megan Miranda. Megan is the New York Times bestselling author of All the Missing Girls, The Perfect Stranger, The Last House Guest, a Reese Witherspoon book pick, The Girl from Widow Hills, and Such a Quiet Place. She has also written several books for young adults. She grew up in New Jersey, graduated from MIT, and lives in North Carolina with her husband and 2 children. Her latest book, which I just finished in a fever pitch, is called The Last Vanish, and it is out on July 26th. Welcome, Megan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you.
So fun. I'm so excited too. And Megan and I got to meet actually in person for the first time at Thriller Fest this month in New York City, which was so fun. And she was actually on the panel that I moderated to. Awesome. And that's a different comedic experience that if you could ever get your hands on that audio recording, it might be worth a laugh. But anyway, first off, this is such a good book. I literally devoured it. I had told Megan that before we started the call, I was late for the gym because I was like, I had like 6 pages left and I was like, I am not leaving until I know exactly how this ends. So fun. So tell us about The Last Vanish, Megan.
Yeah, so The Last Vanish is about this small mountain resort town with a very mysterious history. Over the last 25 years, 7 visitors to the area have disappeared without a trace. Most recently, a journalist who was staying at the local inn to investigate this string of disappearances. And it's about a woman named Abby who manages this local inn, and she suddenly finds herself at the center of this new investigation into the town's hidden secrets. And she's sort of the one person who is willing to dive into this kind of notorious history and try and piece together the truth.
And one of the things I love about Abby is that she's been there for a decade. So it's one of those towns where, you're not really from there unless you're from there. So you're sort of on the periphery, but she does sort of manage to be accepted over the course of a decade. And yet she sort of still feels like she's half in, half out. And that is, it makes her position as our investigator, really, really interesting. So, I highly recommend this. This is coming out July 26th. So let's talk a little bit about your path to writing. So First, Megan, you are the first MIT graduate writer that I have ever encountered. I think of MIT more as scientists and mathematicians, of course. So what led you from MIT into writing?
Yeah, I know they seem so different, but it felt like a really natural progression. And, I'm a lifelong reader. I've loved books my whole life. I grew up reading suspense and thrillers, and I loved writing. I was in high school. I didn't really know like the path to becoming a writer, which of course, like there is not really a path. There's 100 or 1,000 different paths. And I love hearing everyone's stories because we all kind of come to this place with very different backgrounds and experiences.
So true.
But I went to school for biology. I worked in biotech for a few years, and I was a high school science teacher for a few years. And, this whole time I was always reading, and always in the back of my mind, I said, I really want to write a book, but I had kind of given it up after high school for a little while. Yeah. And it was when I had kids of my own, when I really came back to it. I'm like, this is my passion. This is what I love to do. Why am I not taking like a real shot at this? And I feel like all of my different experiences kind of informed my ideas because my first books were young adult. They were set in the world of high school, and they were inspired by this weird like science what if question. So I think it felt like a natural progression, even though, I think, looking at it, biology, writing, they don't necessarily seem like they come from the same place, but they were always kind of my two loves.
Right. And it makes sense. There is something sort of, because I came from finance, I spent 10 years in finance, and there is something, you don't want to call it a formula, but there is sort of a pattern and a rhythm that there's something sort of musical, mathematic about writing, right? You have to have a certain, so that kind of makes sense to me. And the biology makes me think of John Green, of course, who's, was also like a science teacher, wasn't he? Anyway, but that makes sense to me. So then though, you did, how many YA books did you do?
My first 5 were young adult, and then All the Missing Girls was my first adult. And then I did 2 more young adult as I was doing adult at the same time. So
how many books do you have out? You have a lot of books.
This is number 13.
I love it. That's amazing. Okay. So what happened with All the Missing Girls? What was the transition to venturing into adult fiction?
So it's interesting because like looking back at it, I don't think there was a moment where I was like, I'm going to write an adult book right now. It was more like, I feel like it really comes down to the character and the story, and that I'm not someone who like comes with plot first. It's more character first. And so it's really like, what's the right character who's suited for this type of story, this type of experience. And when I started writing All the Missing Girls, I really wasn't sure at first, because I knew this backstory of what happened when the characters were in high school. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I kind of got a few chapters in, I realized this book kind of needed an element of hindsight. And it was, the aftermath 10 years later, and looking back at this event and how, characters moved on from it or didn't, and a new mystery that kind of brings them back. So it felt again like this kind of natural progression to, I'm writing an adult book.
Right.
As opposed to kind of sitting back and being like, what's my adult idea? Where are my adult characters? Kind of let the story inform it. Do you find the same? Are you a character?
Well, for me, it's a certain situation, someone who wakes up on, and doesn't know how they got to where they are, or something more like that. And then I figure out who is the character that would be in that position. So I'm kind of the opposite, I think, but, so that's really interesting. So now you have teenage children. So when you were writing, were you reading your books to your children, or they were a little young? How did it play out with them?
It was funny because when I started writing, they were 1 and 3. And the idea of them reading my books was something that was like so far in the distant future that I couldn't even fathom it.
Right.
And then I remember my daughter asking me like, when can I read this? And I was like, when you're 10, which again seemed like it was like
ages and ages and ages ago, right? And you're talking about the YA, obviously, not the adult fiction.
The YA. Yes. Right. So they start. Both of my kids have read most of my YA books, but they were older when they were kind of that age,
right?
So it was.
Have they read the adult fiction yet?
They have not. And I also, they've talked about it, but also I feel like they almost know the plots because I'm talking about them so much. So they'll sort of be like, oh, that one, is that where XYZ happens? And I'm like, yep, well.
So spoiler, the kids already know the end. That's so funny. So do you find yourself then when you're working through a book, you talk about it at home and your family, they don't just look at you. My family was like, what are you talking about? Who are these people? They don't want to hear anything about it.
I mean, they do, like, a lot of times I'll be asking for help with titles. And so that's when I'm sort of giving the premise. I don't usually like talk out my mystery plots with the family, but I do titles are like the last thing that come for me. So sometimes I'm just trying to like brainstorm ideas. And
why are those the hardest words? I tell you, the titles are the hardest words.
Yes.
I totally understand that. Well, that's funny. So so they haven't read but they're old enough now. My daughter started reading my fiction when she was going into college. So maybe you're not quite there yet. There's no rush, because then they have lots of things to say, like, why did you do this to this person? And you're like, I can't really explain that to you. So okay, so you start with a character. This is so interesting. So Abby came to you first.
So I will say this one was a little different. There's it's usually a character and something else. And this was very much thinking about a town as well, like a town with a notorious history, but maybe that history is like much more recent than, you know, another type of town, but it's a town that embraces this history and sees it as part of their identity. And so I was thinking about a character who's a part of this world, but not entirely, just like you were saying, like has a foot in and a foot out. She's been there a decade. She feels like she's a member of it. It is her home. She loves it. She loves it in. And yet there's still this boundary that she cannot fully get across to kind of know all of their history.
Right. And the thing is interesting, we talked about this a tiny bit, but also before the call, is that your books, you know, I feel like when we, you know, you read an author's books and you feel like you could read a book and say, I know this is a Megan Miranda book because it feels like a Megan Miranda or a Danielle Girard book or whatever. But I just recently read Such a Quiet Place, which is your last release from last summer. And then now this, and they feel so different. And we were talking about that a little bit because that's really unusual. And not just, of course, Such a Quiet Place was, you know, in a tiny cul-de-sac, and it was, you know, a group of neighbors, but it was also multiple points of view. And this is, you know, this is just it's single point of view, it's first person, and I think that was mixed, right? It was Such a Quiet Place. It was, you were in the first person for the main character, but then other people in third.
You had like the message boards, which kind of gave you an insight into the other characters.
Right. Yeah. I guess that's right. Okay, so it wasn't really multiple. That's right. You did that. But
you were kind of getting other perspectives from that. You're right.
Totally. Yeah. That was very clever. So I felt like they're very different. And Abby it's not just, of course, this current mystery. There's a theme of going through Abby where she's sort of also in a process of discovering kind of, you know, who she is. She's obviously now, she was young when she got there, right? Yeah. Her mother had passed away. I don't think I'm ruining anything. And she was sort of finding herself, and now she's 10 years in and on really sort of settling into who she is. And I feel like that process for you, it makes sense that you start with character because she has so much depth and so many layers as she's trying to understand, you know, who she is, what's her place, not just in this town, but sort of, you know, in the world, and what does she owe to these people who have gone missing. So it's really, I'm talking out loud because I'm just trying to understand your process, but I think that's so interesting. So tell us how much you knew, like, walk me through a little bit, like, what do we know when you started this? The town was part of it, and Abby was part of it. And you talked a little about sort of the history of the town. What did we know? What did you know about Abby when you started to write?
So
you can remember.
Little. Like I feel like, you know, I enjoy that part of the process of going in not knowing, because like the character for me is sort of the fun mystery of like unwinding who you are, who you want to be, what your relationship is with all of these different people. And like you said, like, what does she owe these people who have disappeared that are strangers? And what does she owe these people who have taken her in as one of their own as well? And like that dynamic kind of coming into play. So it varies with every book. What I know, I usually do not know the ends of my books.
Interesting.
I usually know one of the thread, like one of the subplots that kind of like a backbone. So I either know where I want the character to end up, kind of like that arc, or I know something that happened in the past. Everything in this book was a mystery except like the town itself when I started.
Interesting.
I love going into that with the main character who doesn't know who they can trust, because it allows me to kind of channel that. Like, I don't know what characters to trust. There's this feeling of like, you know, paranoia sometimes. So I love that process in a first draft, though I also sometimes reach like this panic level of like, I really should know.
Of course.
Right.
Of course. You're like, wait, I'm 2/3 through and I still have no idea.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And then you got to go back and rewrite once you figure it out. Yes.
Which is part of the process. Well, that's interesting. So you're not a plotter.
No.
So you just sort of, you're channeling Abby, you're channeling sort of what she does and doesn't know. And of course, in this book, which, the other thing that comes to town is this, so small towns, there's weather is really extreme. Technology is not very, you can only get cell service in one little corner of the office. So there's all these sort of challenges that actually, I'm in Montana, so I am familiar with some of those, they're actual, that's a real thing, right? The phone lines go down because of, a storm or wind or, and that also adds to and the thing that's wonderful about this town, which is true, I think of each one of us, is that everybody has a secret, right? Everybody has, and whether those secrets are really nefarious or not, it's just things that we don't necessarily want to admit. And she is discovering those, about, everyone as she goes along, which is really, anyway, it's so interesting. So, okay. So your process is that you sort of write along with your character,
Mm-hmm.
and then to the end of the book.
So I've done that, and it's sort of like a disaster. Like, where did I go wrong sometimes?
Yes.
So when I say I don't plot, I mean, I don't plot at the start, but I definitely, there's kind of like, I guess, turning points. And so when I start a book, if I can see, okay, this is kind of my 50-page turning point of like the launch, right? The setup into the launch. And I feel like I can write that. Usually the thing I see pretty early on is like the halfway point. And that's kind of the moment where maybe the perspective shifts dramatically of what we thought was happening, or it puts things into different perspective. So it's not necessarily like the big aha reveal twist, but something that I'm working towards at the halfway. And then when I get there, I try to make sure I at least can see, if not like the exact whodunit, like how that's going to play out. So it becomes kind of like a skeleton.
Yes.
Is that how you work as well, or do you plot?
No, I actually, I think I'm more on the disaster level. I'm trying to get better about this, but I tend to go sort of all the way through. And then, and my out files oftentimes, that's what I call anything I remove from the draft ends up in an out file. And oftentimes, if the book is 100,000 words, the out file is like 60. Which really is painful. So I'm, and I'm 15 books in, and you think I'd get smarter, but not yet. I'm working on it. I'm working on getting smarter. But I know what you're saying, because there is, I have that too. I think I do get lost. So do you then does somebody read those for you? You have, when you get to sort of this point, you're like, does this first half hold up?
Yeah. So sometimes it depends, like, when my deadlines are and how far I am in the process too. But I usually send an early look to my editor as well, to kind of make sure like this is the set is working. This is kind of what we were all hoping it would be. And a lot of times, like, I'm someone really interested in the way stories are told. So sometimes I try different structures, and that's when you talk about like throwing out things or 60,000 words. I mean, I've had to rewrite books because the structure wasn't right. It wasn't the right way to tell a story. And then, I have my 10th book, I rewrote like 4 to 5 completely different drafts. So I feel you on that.
Yes, I think it's like you said, everybody's process is different. And unfortunately, every book is different, right? You think, oh, now I know how to write a book. And it's not true. So you are known. I mean, you are like, everyone's like, oh, Megan Miranda plot twist. It's like, you are sort of the queen of the plot twist, which is, and so interesting then to me to talk about the fact that you don't necessarily know that's coming. Or is that one of those pieces of the sort of skeleton that you sort of see from a little bit further away? Or do you write back into it? How does that work?
Sometimes, like, it really, and I guess the thing that I like, because I feel like I love reading plot twist books and twisty books, and you always try and figure them out as you're reading. And so I try to be like, even if you're going to see the big one, there's a lot of little surprises along the way that or things that resonate and are meaningful. So I don't necessarily, like, I see little ones, and sometimes I feel like those have the most impact. And so I try to, sometimes when I'm plotting, as I'm writing, it's not necessarily about what happens, but what's revealed or what you learn in each section. And so that's
smart.
Kind of the reveal.
Yeah, you're good at holding things back, which I think is an interesting thing. Like I think my instinct is always like, the reader needs to know all these things. and yet that's really where we're supposed to sort of not, we're supposed to hold that stuff back. And that, I think you do a really good job with Abby. Even at the very end, there's things that are gonna you're gonna find out. So I love that. And I think readers are so smart, right? That they're gonna, oftentimes those big plot twists, it's almost impossible to keep them from figuring it out unless you sort of cheat, which, I, as a reader and as a writer, I don't love as much, which, so I love the fact that there's no cheats in here. You're not in somebody's point of view and just not telling us something that they would know and that they would be thinking about. So, but that is, I think you're right. You do a really good job of sort of like, there's information that comes out in unexpected moments, and those are wonderful twists. So, it's a well earned, no-mer for you. Okay, so now, how long does it take you to sort of draft a book? Because you're on an annual deadline, right? You've got a book out every year.
It's hard to say because I feel like the second half of my book goes much faster than the first half. I do the same. Like, it takes me a while for the setup and having all the pieces, and now I know my characters. And if there's something I figure out, then it's like, okay, now I go back and rework that. So, I usually have, like, for this book, I actually remember exactly when I had the idea, because I was on a walk in my neighborhood and I took a picture, and it was in like this trail in the woods. And it was like, I had this, like, it was a scene I wrote as soon as I got home.
I love it. Yeah.
And that was, I think, the beginning of October. And I turned my draft in right before my last book came out. So it was the beginning of July. So that was that feels kind of like my process.
Yeah. That's right. About like eight months, probably start to finish. And the majority of that time is spent laying the foundation, which makes sense, right? Once you know the foundation, you know the world, everything happens a little faster. So that's fun. So do you, I know you have your mom, we were talking about this, you're a chauffeur, you don't have a driver yet. So are you sort of get the kids off and then work during the day?
I am. I am a creature of habit. I find routines very helpful for me. I like to write in this. This is where I write every day. I like to have that. You close your door, you leave that part of the world behind. Right. And then at the end of the day, you leave it, close that door.
Close the door, process laundry, make dinner, do all the mom things. Absolutely. Yes. Well, that's so exciting. Okay. So this is 13. Is that what you said? Number 13, Lucky 13. Okay. So what's next? What are you working on? Obviously you're well into, or have already turned in the draft for the next one. So crazy, this business. What are you working on?
So it's another kind of, book in this vein. I always say that, like, I joke with my editor that I always set books either like in the woods in the mountains or next to the water. And
yes, you do. You
the water
okay.
next year. So I don't want to say too much because I'm still in the process, and because I don't do too much plotting up front, some things can change before, but yes, it should be out next year.
That's so exciting. That's so exciting. Okay. Well, this is fabulous. So this will be out in just a heartbeat. Tell us where do we find all the information about you and all your books, your website, social media, all that good stuff.
Okay, so my website's meganmiranda.com. You can sign up for my newsletter through there or find my social media links. I'm probably most active on Instagram, Megan L. Miranda there, and Facebook, author Megan Miranda.
Wonderful. Well, this was so fun. It was so good to have a chance to talk about this book and all of your books, and everybody should go and pick this up. And until I look forward to the next one, and I hope you'll come back and visit us again. This has been the Killer Women podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Girard. You can find me at daniellegirard.com. And this has been our chat with Megan Miranda. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thanks so much for having me.